Hello? Yes. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this, the Inspired Keynote session of the Congress. This is one of the 4 high-level sessions that has been organized in order to explore the themes of this year's World Library and Information Congress, and in particular, to draw on experience and ideas that will, hopefully, provide new insights and motivation for you in your work. These sessions focuses in particular on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG. I'm sure that a lot of you will be aware of the SDGs. These are being increasingly widely taken up across our field as a key reference point, in particular in advocacy. For those who are not aware, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are a part of the United Nations 2030 Agenda, a comprehensive roadmap agreed by governments in 2015 for sustainable development. Unlike previous texts, the 2030 Agenda applies to all member states and covers the full range of policies necessary for sustainable development. Thanks to the monitoring mechanisms it includes, including a call on governments to develop their own national development plans and to report back to peers through voluntary national reviews, it also offers some powerful opportunities for advocacy and engagement. Crucially, however, the agenda and the goals are not just a set of labels that can be applied after the event to a pre-existing work plan. They are also a new way of thinking about how we, not just governments, but also libraries and all other stakeholders, contribute to economically, socially, environmentally, and culturally sustainable development. So this is where the Inspired themes comes in, because the 2030 Agenda is designed to be one that doesn't necessarily set out new goals, but inspire a new way of doing things, with better awareness of the linkage between policy areas and better awareness of who can be involved in delivering success. Our speakers here today, therefore, are going to be helping us to go more deep on why the SDGs are different and what they mean for the way that governments, that libraries go about their work. We honor it to be joined by 2 Irish speakers who bring unique perspective on the SDG, and then 2 highly active librarians whose engagement with SDG has led them to do new things in their own work. First of all, then, I would like to invite David Donoghue to speak. David was Ireland ambassador to the United Nations 2013 to 2017, following a distinguished and varied career in Ireland's Foreign Service. In particular, he co-facilitated the process of agreeing the 2030 Agenda alongside the permanent representative of Kenya, and so was right at the center of discussions around SDGs. Added to this is his work in reviewing process of the Millennium Development Goals and the New York Declaration on Large Movement of Migrants and Refugees. Thank you so much, David. Please come join.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You can hear me, can you? It's a great pleasure to be here. I was, as you just heard, I was the Irish ambassador to the United Nations until a few years ago, and it fell to me and to the ambassador of Kenya to co-chair the negotiations which agreed the Sustainable Development Goals and the wider 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. You might ask, what was that? What significance does it have? Basically, this was the biggest thing that the UN ever did, measured in terms of the scale of the commitments that member states were undertaking, the number of people who were involved in trying to agree this new agenda, and the number of stakeholders, whether the academic community, whether the private sector, whether civil society, or indeed yourselves as librarians, the number of people who are helping to implement this agenda. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before, either at the UN or in the world. Why do I say that? Well, we had originally Millennium Development Goals, which were announced in the year 2000, obviously. There were 8 of them. They had not been negotiated. They were simply devised by a couple of people at the UN and announced. There were 8 of them, and some progress was made on them over the subsequent 15 years. But as those 15 years continued, there was a real sense that the world had to actually implement the principle of sustainable development more fully. That means that you recognize the interconnections between several key dimensions. If you're trying to tackle poverty, as in getting better health and education outcomes and raising the basic standard of living, if you're trying to do that, you also have to look at the environmental dimension in all its aspects, whether climate, whether the degrading of oceans, of natural environments, and you also had to look at economic policies. So those 3 dimensions, the economic, the social, and the environmental, together comprise the concept of sustainable development. And the world felt that an effort should be made to devise new goals for the period 2015 to 2030, which would speak to those 3 dimensions and which would work on the interaction between all 3. So if we're trying to get, for example, better health outcomes for people all over the world, we have to also look at related issues such as access to water, such as access to education, such as gender equality, such as human rights. So you have many, many other aspects which interact with the basic health goal and in fact which have to be taken into account if we're going to achieve better health. So that's just to give an example of how integrated all of these dimensions are. So that particular perception, although you may think it's natural, it wasn't widely understood or agreed until we came up with the SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals set out 17 goals, some of which were already in the earlier set of goals, but some of which were quite new. For example, there's one relating to sustainable cities, another one relating to sustainable oceans. These were quite new. So the 17, if you like, is an advance on the 8 goals from the year 2000. A second big difference is that every country in the world was involved in negotiating these goals and everything that goes with the goals. 193 countries at the UN had to agree on every word of this agenda. And my role and that of the Kenyan ambassador was to get all of that over the line. We had to produce successive drafts of the program, of the new agenda, until eventually agreement was reached. The third key point is that every country in the world is now implementing this new agenda. It's not legally binding. That would have been too ambitious because you'd have very small developing countries who would say, quite rightly, that they don't have enough capacity to make the progress required each year. But even if it's not legally binding, every country in the world has accepted that it is a politically and even morally binding agenda. That's to say that every government has undertaken to reflect and to take account of the goals in framing its own national policies, in framing its own programs for government. So that it was, it is unprecedented. The world had never actually had that before. It means that the US, as much as the Maldives or the Marshall Islands, has promised to reflect these globally agreed goals in its own national policies. And the same goes for every country that you represent. So this is a unique experiment almost in mankind setting goals for itself and trying to achieve global solutions to global problems. So we are recognizing that we all share many problems, and that frequently the best way to achieve solutions is learning from others, cooperating with others, understanding how problems can be mastered in other countries. So the theme of the SDGs is mutual learning. And there I come to a very important part of your function, which is that you as librarians are guardians of a kind of repository of knowledge and of data and of research worldwide. You are not just guardians of it, you are in some ways acting to expand it. You are trying to ensure access to information for everybody on the planet. And that is an issue which affects basic human rights. It affects empowerment of human beings. It affects equality. So it's not just that information in the particular sectors of health and education and so on, it's not just that such information is vital in terms of achieving that goal, but more generally, you as librarians have a very privileged position. You are able to raise the awareness of these global goals among ordinary citizens, men, women and children, and you're able to help, therefore, to achieve the goals. Now, you might well ask, is it realistic that goals which are as ambitious as these would be achieved by 2030? Because as the name implies, what the world agreed to was that we would achieve them all by 2030. In the meantime, it's 2022, and we've had a number of major setbacks, notably the pandemic, which nobody would have seen coming, and the Russia-Ukraine war and its reverberations, which perhaps might have been foreseen, but nobody would have foreseen it on this scale. So those are two major shocks with which we've had to deal in the last couple of years. That said, I keep in touch with the debates at the UN on how we are doing with the SDGs. And the one thing that's clear to me is that this agenda, however ambitious, even though it's very ambitious, this agenda is seen as the only way forward. The phrase used is that we will build back better after COVID-19 on the basis of the SDGs. We have to build back better, and the SDGs is the way to do it. It opens up the door to a more sustainable, a fairer, a more equal world. So far from the SDGs being less relevant than they were before the pandemic, they're now actually more relevant. And that is, it's a pleasant and a reassuring thing. All the 193 governments who signed up to the SDGs in 2015 are still fully committed. There is no government which has said, we're changing our minds. If you take, say, the Paris Climate Agreement, which is like the other side of the same coin, the US notoriously backed out of the Paris Agreement a couple of years ago. Now they're back in. But there are other examples of where an individual government can express doubts about some global agreement. But with the SDGs, everybody is still on board. Everybody is still committed, and even more committed as the years go by. Finally, my final point is, what happens if we don't achieve them by 2030? My guess is that they will simply continue on. I mean, I shouldn't perhaps say this wearing an official hat, but the truth is, we're now at a stage where on many of the goals, the indicators do not look so good. We are actually going backwards because of the shocks I mentioned. But the political will to go forward and try and achieve them by 2030 is still very, very strong. And I think what will happen is that if we don't make it by 2030, we will continue on, and they will be our blueprint for the subsequent decade or so. So one way or another, can I applaud you for what you are doing individually and in your own countries to raise public awareness of the Sustainable Development Goals and to help to achieve what is an unprecedented experiment really in human organization. It's something which it sets out to save to literally save lives, to make life better for millions of people worldwide. Even if we don't achieve them in full, partial achievement is still worth aiming for. So with that, I will hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. So without delay then, I want now to invite Paul Walsh to take the floor. Paul Walsh is Vice President of Education at the United Nations Sustainable Development Solution Network, where he is Director of the SDG Academy and University College Dublin Professor of International Development Studies. Please, Paul.
So thank you very much for the kind invitation today. So it's great to be here. So before I get into my talk, I just want to reflect a little bit on the contribution of David Donoghue to the intergovernmental negotiations on what we know now as the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And I don't know whether David remembers this, but he was only in New York a few weeks, I think, and we invited him to be in the inaugural conference at what we call the International Conference on Sustainable Development that's held in Columbia University every year. We have it for the last 10 years, hosted by Jeffrey Sachs. Our first two speakers were actually David Donoghue and Amina Mohammed. And Amina Mohammed obviously went on to be the Deputy Secretary General in charge of implementing the Sustainable Development Agenda. And of course, David went on to actually guide the whole negotiation process and to bring us to a successful conclusion in September 2015. But I don't know whether David remembers this, and this is just to be a bit inspirational for us all. When I introduced David, Seamus Heaney had just died. So he's our Nobel laureate in education, a poet from Ireland. And the poem I read out was Digging, right? Now, I'm not going to read that poem for you, but the thing is, the last bit there, basically, you know, a lot of us see people, our brothers and sisters and parents, who actually are out there working. They seem to be doing real things, you know, growing food, you know, building bridges. And some of us, as academics, librarians, diplomats, we're kind of in an office or something, right? But what this highlighted is, the poet decided that basically between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, I will dig with it, meaning that his life will be as a poet and a writer. But actually, David, during the negotiations, because I was there as one of the members of the UN Major Group for Science Technology, so I sat in on the 9 months of negotiations, and David was always in the background with his pen, taking notes, right? Because he was the writer. He's a graduate of UCD, and so he was the scholar and the writer in the background. And Kamau was a very charismatic figure who actually entertained the hall. But David sat there and he took notes on everything and everyone, particularly the major groups and other stakeholders included. But what a contribution this is, right? So somebody listening, writing, drafting that document. So what I would say to you, I know you're librarians, so when I have a brother who's a horticulturist, so I don't assume he's actually going to do gardening, but I know what I'd encourage you to do is read the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Transforming Our World, because it's written beautifully. It has a lovely preamble. It's got a vision statements. It has call to actions. It's got means of implementation. It's got the goals and targets. It's got the follow-up and review processes. And it was written so well that nobody had any comments or corrections, and everyone, the 193 states, just accepted it as it was, which is remarkable. So normally these things go right up to the wire in terms of, you know, the September meeting, but this was signed off on August 9th, I think, and it was all put to bed, and it was really successful. But you know, Ireland is a young country, and to have the likes of Noel Dore in the early days of the Security Council, and now David Donoghue, who negotiated the the SDGs is just truly remarkable. And of course, he might say his contributions to the Good Friday Agreement or the New York Declaration on Migration are maybe more important, I don't know. But for this talk today, I just wanted to honour that. And in UCD, we have given him an honorary doctorate, so has the NUI. So he has really got a lot of kudos for the work that he has done. Yeah, I think we should. Yeah. Okay, so, I need to go backwards, sorry. So we did, a few of us already presented at IFLA Parle, which was a pre-conference, and this was the idea of scientists working more closely with the librarians and research people who work in European parliaments. And in fact, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, David would be glad to hear, we're now the formal secretariat for the MEP Alliance run by Andrews, right? So this again is the whole idea of the importance of the work that librarians can do, whether it's in public schools or in universities, but also supporting ministers and parliaments. Like, you've the power to create that knowledge, to make it available, particularly to the work of committees of parliaments, etc. So working with the likes of us and academics is I just see it as so important, okay? So my work at the moment is that we do create courses. So I don't know whether you know the SDG Academy, but if you go to sdgacademy.org, all of these are on edX. This was traditionally the MIT Harvard platform, which is now bought by 2U, a company. But all of these are open source courses. And in fact, I would say to you that we have Creative Commons license on them, so we actually can make them collapsible, put them into your repositories anywhere in the world. And we're actually working on the idea that we have a remix license so that people can start maybe what I call build your own teddy bear, take bits and pieces and add pieces, translate into different languages, make it more relevant for the local context that it's used. But please contact me if you're interested in these open source education resources that we develop and we continue to develop. And of course, David is a star in one of them. I don't see it there on the leadership one, but he's in one of these as well. One project that we're working with IFLA is called Mission 4.7. Mission 4.7 basically is tracking Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is the education goal, but it's looking at Target 7, right? And this is the whole idea of having lifelong learning, right? So what we want to do in Mission 4.7, and we brought together people from global schools, from the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, UNESCO itself, the Center for Sustainable Development, Columbia University, and even other partners like AIU and now IFLA, etc. And our mission really is to ensure that maybe from preschool, that people start to understand how they interact with society and how they interact with the environment. Because I think this is what David was saying is absolutely correct, that more than ever, people are starting to think, in my everyday activities, how do I really interact with the environment? Like the air quality, the nature of climate change, the health of the oceans, looking at the food systems, like what the nutrition of the food you're eating, and then also looking at water quality, like how clean is the water, etc., and how available is the water. And so all of us, in a sense, are interacting with that all the time. But even, it's just amazing in this integrated economic system that we have, is that we're actually affecting everyone all over the world and every species nearly in a daily sense, right? So I think the first step is to go, I want to learn how I coexist with nature and how I coexist with humanity. Because I do not want to be part of the problem that is destroying nature and that is creating pain on individuals all over the world. I want to know how I coexist with that. And that is the first step. But unfortunately, this is something you should be learning in preschool, at every level of schools, and in the universities, and then also, and the problem is that so many of us have not got that education. We all have to go back to school. And that's why companies and government departments and civil societies are coming to us in the SDG Academy and going, we want to go back to school. We want to upskill, we want to learn this stuff, because we didn't learn it when we were children, and we should know this stuff, right? And of course, then when you learn, so first your heart says, there's something I should know, your head says, I need to learn it, and then you make a plan, and then you take an action, right? Now I'm going to tell you about the action I'm doing, but of course the action that librarians do, or people in other walks of life, can be very different. So let me tell you about what Mission 4.7 is up to. We presented, the first time we presented this idea about open education resource repositories that should be fair, and I'll explain in a minute, that should have Creative Commons licenses, remix licenses, that should be delivered in what we call diamond engagements. You're the librarians, you're the experts, you probably know what I'm talking about. But the idea is that it's all very fine to say, you know, education is a public good. Every kid should go to school. But their education resources are really not available, and they're very expensive, right? That's really not good enough, right? Because we know a lot of education resources are actually created by academics or public servants. They are potentially capable of putting a property right in them. You potentially can put them into digital repositories. You can potentially make them accessible and interoperable all over the world. You can potentially have a license that allows people update and translate and put in their own material. So basically, all school books and all school resources at every level should be free, right? The librarians know this, I know this, the governments have to know this, right? And we are pushing this hard in for what's called the Transforming Education Summit in the General Assembly in September. We were pushing this in the pre-summit in Paris, and we're going to continue this. We want governments, we want librarians, we want the universities to sign up to this mandate. It's already a legal mandate under the UN to have open education resources. But I want open education resources repositories. I want the public sector, the non-profit sector, to take control of the property right and to deliver these resources for free all over the world, in every language, in every culture, because we are capable of doing that. And something like IFLA and all its members are actually very capable of doing this, so we need to coordinate. We introduced this idea in the Science Technology Innovation Forum. We followed up, thanks to the Irish government. David would be delighted that Gilroy, is it John Gilroy, he was very good. He immediately got in contact with the ambassador of Ireland to UNESCO, and they facilitated us to have a side meeting, as it was called, at the pre-summit, and the Government of Ireland sponsored us and hosted us as Mission 4.7, and we pushed this idea of transforming education for sustainable development with fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, open education resource repositories using digital innovation and diamond partnerships. Diamond, to you know what I mean by diamond publications. It's free to put up, right? Because in publications, academics now pay something like $3,000 or $4,000 to actually pay to publish in Nature. That's nonsense. And then it's open access. But it's not open access with a DOI. It's not distributed all over the world, right? It's nothing like this, right? So what's happened to data, what's happened to research papers, cannot happen to education resources. This is where we say no, and as a collective group of public servants or non-profits, we say no. We own the intellectual property, we'll put a Creative Commons license on it, we'll distribute it through public institutions, and everyone everywhere around the world should be able to edit, update, translate, and it should be an open and free public good to all, because there is no point having schools and teachers if you don't have free educational resources, if they become one of the biggest expenses. And of course, I'm an economist, so I can turn around and say, the biggest bill I get when I'm running a master's and I have to come up with a full economic costing, I see the cost of the library to me per student in running the master's. That's because you're paying JSTOR. That's because you have all these expenses, right? If we get to a point where we own the property right, it's free, it will reduce the cost on the government, on the households, on the universities and training teachers, etc. But more importantly, in a reuse license, if anyone uses that for commercial, who do they pay? They have to pay the public sector, right? So we get the money if it's used commercially because it was our property in the first place, okay? So I've explained what this is. So just to finish, this is the work I'm doing with this great team here. So we're very open. We have offices in New York, now in Dublin, in Paris, and in Kuala Lumpur. We don't just do open education resources from preschool all the way up through university and professional training, which we do, but we also do what we call global diplomacy, which I'm talking about today. But we also have other, you can learn about, these are partners that we work with. Mainly philanthropic people give us the money to do what we want to do. We're very thankful to Jeffrey Shah Foundation in particular. And here are the issues. If you want to go, the SDG Academy is for these resources that we can give you. You can do online. You have the Masters in Development Practice program if you wanted to set that up. Mission 4.7, the Global Schools program is for what we call primary and secondary school or elementary up to high school, etc. So we have wonderful resources that we've shared in 5 languages already that we're distributing around the world. And here are our Twitter feed and Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and we've just started TikTok because we know that's where all the young people go. And I've done one very good one myself, by the way, so you can have a look at that. I don't think so, but I tried to put a Harry Styles. I just tried to be popular because I know my daughters like Harry Styles. Okay, so thank you.
That was wonderful, Paul. I will definitely recommend the SDG Academy.
Good.
Thank you. Well, so now it's time to move on to our library speakers, Adriana and Damilare. Adriana Cibel Ferrari is Vice President of the Federation of Brazilian Library Associations and Technical Director of the Library at the Faculty of Philosophy, Humanities, and Science at the University of Sao Paulo. She's a member of IFLA Public Library Section's Standing Committee, as well as our Latin American and Caribbean Regional Division Committee. Thank you, Adriana.
Thank you, Jonathan. First of all, I would like to express my solidarity to the families and friends of the millions of people who had their lives shortened by COVID-19. My work as an advocate for a 2030 agenda started in 2016 as a president of Brazilian Federation of Library Association Institutions. Since then, we are promoting several activities in order to demonstrate that all libraries could and should be strategic partners at the SDG. Oh, Jesus. Is he? Okay. We are able to identify many actions by Brazilian public libraries as well libraries at school and universities specialized that in fact came together to be advocates of the 2030 agenda. We published Libraries for a Better World. We went in line with IFLA's publication. Furthermore, we promoted the actions that we are discussing in 2017 at the most important congress in our field held in Brazil. Advocacy for the 2030 agenda in developing countries such as Brazil aims in fighting for the implementation of the agenda whilst we raise awareness on the importance of libraries. The extent of libraries deficit for a continental-sized country, combined with an absence of public policies being aggraved by the Bolsonaro administration and the COVID-19 pandemic, cause more libraries who have their activities closed. So I always understood that it was necessary to fight for the 2030 agenda beyond the library field, together with the other actors in the society. For this reason, in 2018, we participated in the second Forum of Sustainable Development in the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, organized a side event entitled The Importance of Access to Information to Achieve Sustainable Development in Latin America and Caribbean, which culminated the launch the Santiago's Declaration. On that occasion, I got to know about the dynamics of the civil society participation that works with the specific themes of the 2030 Agenda. And there in Chile, we saw some Brazilian NGOs that were part of the Agenda 2030 work group. We applied to be in this group. In 2019, FEBAB was accepted. The Civil Society Working Group for the 2030 Agenda works to transform the sanitation into effective action in daily life of the country. The group was formed from the understanding that both the definition and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal should take in account the background of civil society organizations that have been working directly on the advocacy, on the respect to the limits of the planet, and on the fight against inequality. The group communications and highlights the importance of the sustainable goals and the potential impact of their implementation on people territories. It also gauges, analyzes, and produces contents that inform their incidence in social actions, including the annual production of the Spotlight Report. The Spotlight Report is an important instrument that reviews the situation in the country. Thus, we have to consider the reality in the development of our services to the community, especially in the public libraries that serve the most vulnerable populations. In addition to the work of the work group, we have been collaborating with the Institute for Defense of Human Rights in the Brazilian Universal Periodic Review process on specific targets related to the SDGs 3, 4, 6, 10, 11, and 16. I would like to point out, through the work group and also through the work of the Universal Periodic Review, I was able to meet institutions that work in line with a set of specific SDGs and learn from them. It's important to know to be able to promote partnerships in the communities where libraries are inserted. I am currently a co-facilitator of the 2030 Agenda Work Group, and I intend to continue working on the agenda's advocacies. These activities have impacted my work in libraries and, above all, my activism with FEBAB. Now, more than ever, I am convinced the better work for all librarians' efforts should be focused on the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. I really feel more motivated in changing to promote the agenda and contribute so that libraries are definitely spaces that transform people's lives. I believe that libraries should be part of a network for the defense of human rights, and together with the other entities contribute to a society where no one is left behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana. I am witness of the great work that FEBAB is doing. So thanks once again. So now we're going with Damilare Oyedele. He's the founder of Library Aid Africa, a startup NGO working to advocate for libraries and train librarians. He's a member of our Sub-Saharan Africa Regional Division Committee and very active in work around the SDGs. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Damilare, and I'm going to be sharing with you my personal experience with the SDGs. I'm working with SDGs, more importantly, how libraries can and are contributing towards achieving the global goals. It all started in 2018 when I attended the African SDG Summit, where I made a presentation on how libraries are essential partners to drive progress towards the SDGs. And this further offers a more opportunity for young people to learn more about their roles in driving progress towards the SDGs. Furthermore, in 2020, this further entails engaging with stakeholders' engagements in various SDG conferences, focusing more on youth engagement in this part of our libraries are very essential to this particular process. However, in 2022, early this year in Addis Ababa, we had a more robust engagement in terms of a 2-day capacity training program where, in partnership with the ECA Library, we trained 27 young librarians in Ethiopia on how to engage in advocacy, VNR reports, and drive progress for the SDGs in Ethiopia. And this further helps us to build capacity of in-country young librarians to be able to understand the process of these things and how to engage meaningfully to drive impact. Going forward, at the Africa Regional Forum on SDGs on the continent, this time at the Africa Regional Forum in 2019, I had the opportunity to speak and engage with UN agencies through presentations on how libraries are and can drive progress for the SDGs. And the following year, in 2020, I was in Victoria Falls at the 6th session of the Africa Regional Forum on SDGs, where at this particular point, we had a more robust experience on high-level stakeholder engagement and advocacy, where we had a side event which we used strategically to engage UN agencies and stakeholders to share more on how libraries are contributing immensely to the global goals. And afterwards, this led to an in-person engagement back home in Nigeria with the Office of the SDGs in Nigeria, where we had advocacy engagement to have libraries included in the VNR process. During this process, we work with stakeholders from various organizations to document the impact libraries are making in Nigeria, and this further led to having libraries reported in the VNR reports of Nigeria in 2020. In line with this, in 2021, we explored a more strategic approach to see how we can build the capacity of in-country library stakeholders to take leadership and responsibility to lead in-country advocacy for libraries. So, we trained in-country library stakeholders in Brazzaville on workshop on SDGs, advocacy and VNR process. They have the skills and knowledge to understand how to engage in-country libraries, in-country stakeholders to have libraries captured in VNR and SDG processes. And more recently in Rwanda, early this year, we also trained librarians in Rwanda, about 50 of them, on SDGs advocacy and VNR, with the process that we're able to empower in-country library stakeholders to understand the power of libraries to achieve the SDGs and how to engage stakeholders in country to lead process of the VNR reports and the SDGs in general. So all this has pointed out to three major things, which my experience has been over the past 4 years as a young person. One, advocacy. Number two, connecting with government agencies. And number three, meaningful engagement. Now, diving into how engaging in SDGs have changed approaches of what I do as a person, as a young person, and how I see this going forward. It has further helped me to provide a framework for advocacy in a way that really responds to government needs. Through government connection and relationships, that has positioned us to be more engaged in VNR process. This was used as a model to train in workshop to participants on stakeholder engagement with the focus to capture libraries in VNR reports in various countries. It has further opened up opportunities to engage with governments that wouldn't existed otherwise and offer an opportunity for many more libraries to become involved in advocacy, because libraries that go through this workshop are empowered with the skills and knowledge to engage in such advocacy and VNR process. Furthermore, it has further offered structure for meaningful engagement with users and partners, making for a more connected, coordinated type of delivery. This connotes a collaborative and stronger team for advocacy. For instance, in Nigeria in 2020, we had to work together with other stakeholders in the SDG space in Nigeria, from the government, from the civil society, and business to work on the VNR report for Nigeria and have libraries represented in the VNR for Nigeria. So, reflecting on my journey as a young person who has been actively involved in the dialogues about the SDGs for libraries in Africa, both at the youth level and also at regional forums, it is imperative to say that over time, this approach has aligned me to understand the process of how the UN system works, about the VNR process and the SDGs, and passing this knowledge to libraries and librarians on how this process works and how they can further engage meaningfully in their various countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Damilare, for this great insight. So, I want to open the floor to you for any questions, as well as any questions that panelists have for each other. We have some time for questions. One or two questions within the panelists or from the audience. Well, if not, I have one for anyone that can answer. What steering effect of the SDG can we see so far, and what is the transformative potential for the next year to come? Please.
Will I
Yes.
answer it from here? Yeah.
Thank you.
Very much. Obviously, under individual goals, progress has been made. Sometimes the progress has been reversed, but you can see in the data which is being collected worldwide, you can see that progress has been made. Now, that was more obvious in the first couple of years before we had the impact of the pandemic. But, for example, extreme poverty levels were certainly going down. One problem, however, was that inequality within countries, between rich and poor, was actually getting worse. So you would see some positive outcomes, but you would also see negative trends. And I'm afraid in the last couple of years, the pandemic obviously put many governments under pressure. The health systems are clearly inadequate in many countries. We also saw vaccine inequity. So some of the improvements that we all hoped to see under the SDGs were neutralized or reduced or removed, in fact, by the pandemic. But I come back to the point I made earlier, and I was actually very glad to hear the emphasis so far on advocacy, the advocacy which can be achieved through libraries. That you may think that these goals are a utopian agenda. In some ways they are. We deliberately stretched ourselves with the targets that we were trying to achieve under each of them. But even though some people might say the goals are almost impossible to achieve, nevertheless the will around the world is that this is the only way forward. And the way in which we can measure that is that every year at the UN there are these sessions of the high-level political forum. That is a conference which reviews what's happening globally. It meets at the UN in New York each July, and indeed the last speaker referred to the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews, which are conducted by each country of its own performance and which are then presented to the UN. So at this HLPF, high-level political forum, which meets every year, it's possible to see or to hear about the progress which countries are making, but almost more important is to hear the enthusiasm with which countries are actively implementing the SDGs as best they can. So, one might have expected countries to say this year in particular that with the double whammy, the double effect of COVID followed by the uncertainties caused by the Ukraine war, one might have expected people to say, look, we will have to take a second look at the SDGs and slow down. The truth is, countries are not saying that. They are clinging even more, with even greater determination to the SDGs. That's simply a fact. And this is despite the many differences between countries. You have countries who are right-wing, countries left-wing, countries which are stable, countries which are experiencing internal conflict. Despite all these differences, every country in the world is signed up, wants to achieve the SDGs. So the focus on advocacy is very, very welcome, because a library is in a position to highlight, for example, the progress or lack of progress being made on, we'll say, the goal about access to water. A library or many libraries can put the spotlight on that, can help to build public pressure on the government concerned or on many governments. So you really have a great potential to influence how we achieve these goals. I just wanted to say that while I have the opportunity, but to try and answer the basic question, we're making some progress, nowhere near as much as we hoped to. However, there's still 7 years to go, and as I hinted, I think somehow we won't have people standing with a stopwatch on the as 2030 comes. I think there will be a realistic acceptance that we need longer to achieve them. But really, the key thing is that one final point I'll make. The notion of transforming the world, transformative change, that may seem like rhetoric, but what it really means is you won't achieve the health goal unless, as I said earlier, you bring a lot of other dimensions in as well. That joined up approach, it takes a while for governments to understand that. You still have a tendency for the health minister in a particular country to think in narrow terms about the health portfolio. But gradually, governments are beginning to see that one policy area affects another one directly and indirectly. So that psychological change or political change is almost as important as the actual progress we're making in a given year. The fact that a government will, on the one hand, see a positive opportunity to make progress on a particular goal by working in what it's doing in other goals, that's a good thing. But equally, if a government spots that there could be a conflict with something it's intending to do, we call this a trade-off, where a government sees that it is possibly going to endanger the education goal if it does something relating to human rights. So this psychological reconditioning is actually very, very important, as much as the actual concrete progress achieved.
Thank you so much, David. So we come to the end of our hour, and I want to thank sincerely our panelists once again. David, Paul, Adriana, and Damilari, please give them to applause. You offer great insights, and I hope that we achieve our goal of showing how the SDGs can be an inspiration to libraries everywhere. And especially, thank you, David, for mentioning the high-level political forum, which is very crucial for our work. Thank you so much. Goodbye.